Hey there! Tonight, we're going to the edges of the day for a medieval peasant. It begins not with the chime of a clock, but with the subtle shift from gray to lighter gray in the single unglazed opening of a one-room hut. The air is thick with the lingering smoke from the central hearth, a smell that clings to the rough wool of their clothes and the thatch of the roof. Livestock, brought in for the night, for warmth and safety, stir in their penned-off section of the dwelling, their sounds and smells an inseparable part of domestic life. The floor is cold, hard-packed earth covered with a scattering of straw, often damp and teeming with insects. This is the world of the medieval peasantry, a class that constituted up to 85% of the population of Europe. Their lives were not measured in hours and minutes, but were dictated by the sun's arc across the sky, the turning of the seasons, and the unyielding demands of an agrarian calendar that promised survival but never security. To view the medieval peasant as a mere passive victim of circumstance, a wretched figure perpetually bowed by oppression and misfortune, is to miss the core of their story. The reality is far more complex and compelling. The medieval peasant was an active, often shrewd, agent in their own survival. Through a sophisticated combination of deep-seated agricultural knowledge, resilient community structures, subtle and overt forms of resistance, and an ability to seize unforeseen opportunities from the jaws of catastrophe, the peasantry not only endured, but ultimately reshaped the very foundations of European society. Their story is one of profound resilience in the face of a trinity of existential threats. This report will explore the multifaceted survival strategies of the medieval peasantry by examining their struggle against three great and overlapping challenges. First, it will delve into the constant, grinding pressure of the manorial system, analyzing the web of obligations that bound the peasant to their lord and the clever ways in which they navigated, resisted, and sometimes manipulated this system. Second, it will confront the acute cataclysm of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a crisis that pushed the mechanisms of survival to their absolute limit and exposed the deep frailties of the feudal contract. Finally, it will investigate the transformative horror of the Black Death, a pandemic that annihilated a vast portion of the population, but in its devastating wake, paradoxically created the conditions for the peasantry's eventual emancipation and the dawn of a new social and economic order. The weight of the world, surviving the Lord. The constant backdrop to every peasant's life was the intricate and oppressive structure of manorialism. This system, while providing a veneer of stability in a violent age, was fundamentally designed to extract wealth and labor from the vast majority for the benefit of a tiny elite. To survive was not merely to grow food, but to navigate a gilded cage of obligations, laws, and customs that defined one's world from birth to death. Yet within this rigid framework, the manorial system, a gilded cage. Manorialism was the dominant economic and social framework of rural life throughout the medieval period, a system that emerged from the ashes of the Roman Empire to provide a measure of stability in a deeply fragmented and dangerous world. In the absence of a strong centralized state, the manor became the primary unit of organization. It was a largely self-sufficient estate, typically comprising the lord's personal lands, the holdings of the peasants, and vital common lands, all often clustered around a fortified manor house or castle that served as the center of administration and defense. The collapse of Roman centralized authority had created a profound power vacuum. The protections once afforded by the imperial state, its legions, its laws, its infrastructure, vanished, leaving the rural population vulnerable to barbarian invaders, brigands, and the predations of rival warlords. Into this void stepped the local magnates, the powerful landowners who could offer what the state no longer could: protection. In exchange for this security, free farmers and the descendants of Roman colony surrendered their outright land ownership and, in many cases, their personal freedom, binding themselves and their descendants to the Lord and his land. This arrangement was not merely economic. It represented a fundamental delegation of governmental functions to the local level. The lord of the manor became the de facto ruler of his domain. He held legal and economic authority, maintained a private force for defense, and presided over manorial courts that administered justice for everything from petty theft to land disputes. The manor, therefore, functioned as a microstate, and the obligations peasants owed were not simply rent in the modern sense. They were a form of taxation that funded a local government, complete with its own legal system and public works, such as the maintenance of roads and bridges. This reframing of the relationship from a simple landlord-tenant dynamic to one of subject-ruler is essential to understanding the depth of the lord's control over every facet of a peasant's life, from their labor to their very personhood. This feudal contract, as viewed from below, was a deeply unequal but theoretically reciprocal agreement. The lord provided the peasant with a plot of land to cultivate for their own subsistence, and most importantly, offered protection and the administration of justice. In return, the peasant provided the lord with labor, a significant share of their agricultural output, and a host of other fees and payments. This bond was often formalized in a solemn ceremony where the peasant swore an oath of fealty, a pledge of allegiance that bound them to the lord's will. The very landscape of the manor was a physical map of this power structure. The lord's manor house or castle, often set apart and fortified, was the nucleus of authority. The village church, whose priest was often appointed by the lord, represented spiritual authority. The lord's mill, bakery, and wine press were tangible symbols of his economic monopolies. Surrounding this core were the vast open fields, divided into hundreds of narrow strips, a checkerboard of plots where the lord's domain lands were interspersed with the holdings of his tenants, a constant visual reminder of the intermingling of obligation and subsistence that defined the peasant's world. Chains of obligation. The life of a medieval peasant was circumscribed by a complex and burdensome web of obligations, designed to systematically extract the surplus of their labor. This multi-layered system ensured that it was nearly impossible for a peasant to accumulate significant wealth, reinforcing their economic precarity and their dependency on the lord for their land and survival. The most significant of these obligations, particularly for the unfree peasantry, serfs, or villeins, was corvée labor, the requirement to work on the lord's personal lands, the demesne, without pay. This typically amounted to several days a week, often 3, and was a direct diversion of the peasants' time and energy from cultivating their own strips of land, upon which their family's survival depended. During the critical periods of the agricultural year, such as the spring planting and the autumn harvest, the lord could demand additional boon work, compelling the entire village to labor on his fields until his crops were safely sown or gathered. Beyond labor, peasants owed rent for their own holdings. In the earlier medieval period, this was often paid in kind, meaning a substantial portion of the grain, vegetables, or livestock they produced was turned over to the lord. From the 13th century onwards, as a cash economy became more widespread, these obligations were increasingly commuted to fixed money rents, a practice more common for freemen than for serfs. On top of this, every peasant family was subject to the tithe, a mandatory tax to the church amounting to 1/10 of everything they produced. This was a heavy burden, paid in cash or, more often, in the best of their produce or livestock, which was then stored in massive tithe barns. The Lord's economic power extended into the daily necessities of life through a series of manorial monopolies. Peasants were legally forbidden from grinding their own grain or baking their own bread. They were required to use the Lord's mill and the Lord's oven, paying a fee for each use. The same applied to pressing grapes for wine or apples for cider. These fees, while small individually, represented a constant drain on a family's resources and a galling reminder of their dependence. Finally, the Lord's authority permeated the most personal aspects of peasant life through a system of fees and fines known as feudal incidents. A serf could not leave the manor without permission and payment of a fee called shevage. If a daughter wished to marry a man from outside the manor, her family had to pay merchant, a fine to compensate the lord for the loss of a potential laborer and her future children. A fine called lehrweit was levied for extramarital childbirth. Upon a peasant's death, the lord claimed heriot, a death duty that was typically the family's best animal, a crippling blow to the inheriting generation. Each of these obligations served a distinct purpose. Labor dues farmed the lord's lands for market. Rents funded his household. Tithes supported the church. Monopolies generated direct profit. And personal fines reinforced the legal principle that the peasant and their family were assets belonging to the manor. Survival was thus a constant negotiation with a system designed to leave one with the bare minimum. Navigating the system, agency and resistance. While the manorial system was designed for control, the peasant was not a powerless cog in the machine. A spectrum of freedom existed within the peasantry, and avenues for improving one's lot, though narrow, were actively pursued. This demonstrates a high degree of peasant agency, often expressed not through open rebellion, but through pragmatic, calculated, and even legalistic manipulation of the system's own rules. The most fundamental division within the peasantry was between the unfree and the free. Serfs, also known as villeins in England, were legally bound to the land. They could not leave the manor without the lord's permission, owed him regular labor service, and were subject to the full range of feudal fines like merchant and heriot. In contrast, freemen were not tied to the land. They typically held their land in exchange for a fixed cash rent and were at liberty to move to another village or town if they chose. This distinction, however, was not as rigid as it might appear. Economic reality often blurred the legal lines. A freeman struggling with high taxes or a poor plot of land might voluntarily enter into serfdom in exchange for the security of a better holding offered by a lord. Conversely, a particularly industrious or lucky serf could sometimes accumulate more wealth than their free neighbors. This possibility of accumulation points to the primary avenue of social mobility: wealth. Through years of hard work, careful management of their small plots, and perhaps a favorable marriage, a peasant family could save enough money to purchase their freedom from the Lord in a process called manumission. This was a long-term strategy requiring immense discipline, but it was the first and most crucial step on the ladder of social advancement. A more perilous path to freedom was flight. A serf who managed to escape their manor and live within the walls of a chartered town for a year and a day without being captured by their lord was legally declared free. For a select few, the church offered another route. A bright peasant boy, with his lord's consent, could be given to the local monastery or church for an education. With talent and dedication, such a boy could rise to become a clerk, a steward in a noble household, or even, in the most exceptional cases, a high-ranking church official like a bishop. Much of the peasants' agency was expressed within the very institutions designed to control them. Most notably, the manorial court. While the court was the lord's tool for enforcing his rights and punishing transgressions like poaching timber from his forests, it was also a venue governed by the custom of the manor. These customs, built on generations of precedent, were often unwritten but considered legally binding. Peasants, who attended court regularly, frequently developed a more intimate knowledge of these customs than the lord or his steward. They could and did use the court to sue the lord, enforce their rights to common lands, and dispute unfair fines. A woman could go to the court herself to pay the merchant fee, transforming an act of submission into a transaction she controlled. This demonstrates a sophisticated legal resilience, a capacity to leverage the system's own rules for their benefit. Beyond the court, peasants practiced a constant, low-level, everyday resistance. This included foot-dragging on labor services, feigning illness, poorly executing tasks on the domainsie, or secretly grazing an extra animal on the common pasture. While these individual acts were not revolutionary, they collectively chipped away at the lord's efficiency and profits, asserting a small but vital measure of peasant autonomy in a world built on their subjugation. Part 2. The Emptying Sky, Surviving Famine. While the pressures of the manorial system were a chronic condition of peasant life, the early 14th century brought an acute crisis that dwarfed the everyday struggle for subsistence. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a catastrophe on a continental scale, a perfect storm of climatic disaster and systemic failure that tested the limits of human endurance and exposed the profound fragility of the medieval world. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, the catastrophe began not with war or disease, but with a dramatic and persistent shift in the weather. In the spring of 1315, Northern Europe was struck by unusually heavy and relentless rainfall that continued through the summer and into the next year. This event, which some climatologists believe marked the onset of the Little Ice Age, had devastating and immediate consequences for an agrarian society wholly dependent on predictable seasons. The incessant rain triggered a system-wide agricultural collapse. Fields became so waterlogged that they were impossible to plow. Seed grain rotted in the ground before it could germinate, and what few crops did grow were beaten down by the rain or failed to ripen in the cool, sunless conditions. The harvest of 1315 was a disaster, and the harvest of 1316 was even worse. The crisis extended beyond the grain fields. The wet weather made it impossible to evaporate brine, leading to a severe shortage of salt, the primary preservative for meat. Simultaneously, a widespread livestock epizootic, known as murrain, swept through the weakened animal populations, killing enormous numbers of sheep and cattle. By some estimates, as much as 80% of the herds. Peasants were left with no crops, no way to preserve what little meat they had, and dying livestock. The human cost was staggering. The famine was not a localized event. It stretched across the British Isles, France, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, Germany, and into Poland. While precise figures are impossible to obtain, chroniclers and modern historians estimate that between 10% and 25% of the population perished between 1315 and 1322, when Europe finally began to recover. Death came not only from direct starvation, but from the diseases that followed in its wake. Widespread malnutrition weakened immune systems, leaving the population vulnerable to outbreaks of pneumonia, bronchitis, dysentery, and tuberculosis. The Great Famine was a slow, grinding demographic catastrophe that left a deep scar on the European psyche and set the stage for the even greater crisis to come. The economics of starvation. The agricultural collapse triggered an economic crisis of hyperinflation and scarcity. With harvests failing across the continent, the price of food skyrocketed to levels never before seen. In England, the price of wheat, the staple of life, rose by as much as 800%, making bread completely unaffordable for the peasantry. The scarcity was so profound that even the wealthiest were affected. King Edward II of England and his court famously stopped at St. Albans in August 1315 and had difficulty finding bread to purchase. For the common person, the situation was infinitely worse. Emergency grain stores were the private property of lords, nobles, and the church, not public reserves for the common good. These stores were often insufficient even for their owners' needs, and were certainly not distributed to the starving peasantry. The crisis revealed the utter inadequacy of medieval governance. Faced with social unrest and soaring prices, authorities attempted to intervene. In England, King Edward II and his parliament enacted price controls, fixing the cost of basic foodstuffs in an attempt to make them affordable. This well-intentioned policy proved to be a complete disaster, with prices artificially held down far below market value. Farmers and traders had no incentive to sell what little grain they had, and many could no longer afford to bring their goods to market at all. The result was that food disappeared from markets entirely, exacerbating the shortages and worsening the famine. More fundamentally, the famine shattered the moral underpinnings of the feudal system. The core of the feudal contract was the lord's obligation to provide protection in exchange for the peasant's service. While this primarily meant military protection, it carried an implicit guarantee of a basic level of stability and order necessary for survival. The preceding centuries of population growth had already pushed this system to its Malthusian limits, with a population that outstripped the land's capacity to feed it, leaving little margin for error. When the climatic shock hit this overstretched and inefficient system, it broke. The decentralized nature of manorialism prevented any coordinated, large-scale relief effort. Each lord acted in their own self-interest. Some hoarded their grain, while others, like the Prince Bishop of Bingen, cruelly continued to demand full rents and taxes from their starving tenants. When the ruling class proved incapable of providing relief and, in some cases, actively worsened the suffering, the legitimacy of their authority was profoundly damaged. The Great Famine was not merely a natural disaster. It was a systemic failure of the feudal and manorial order, a failure that the peasantry would not forget. Strategies of the starving, faced with systemic collapse and abandoned by their lords, peasants were thrown back on their own desperate resources. Their survival strategies became a grim, descending ladder of choices, each more horrific than the last. The first and most immediate response was to turn to the wild. People flocked to the forests and common lands, the traditional safety net of the rural poor, to forage for anything edible: roots, plants, grasses, nuts, and tree bark. As these meager resources were exhausted and the hunger deepened, a terrible calculus of survival took hold. Peasant families began to consume their future in order to live in the present. They ate the grain that had been set aside as seed for the next year's planting, a choice that guaranteed continued famine even if the weather improved. They slaughtered and ate their precious draft animals, the oxen needed to plow the fields, effectively destroying their primary capital asset and their means of future production. Ultimately, the prolonged starvation tore at the very fabric of society and family. Crime became rampant, with starving people turning to begging, theft, and violence to secure food. The bonds of kinship dissolved under the immense pressure. Contemporary chroniclers report that parents abandoned their young children in towns or forests to fend for themselves, a desperate act that is believed to have inspired dark folktales like Hansel and Gretel. In some families, the elderly reportedly chose to voluntarily starve themselves to death so that the younger, stronger members might have a chance to survive and work the fields again. The most horrifying accounts, repeated in numerous chronicles from across Europe, speak of cannibalism. People were said to have dug up freshly buried corpses for food, and there were reports of individuals murdering and eating others, even their own children. While some historians caution that such stories may have been exaggerated rumors, their widespread presence in the sources speaks to the profound psychological terror and the complete breakdown of social norms that the famine engendered. Part 3, The Shadow of Death, Surviving the Plague. Just a generation after the Great Famine had loosened its grip, a new and even more terrifying catastrophe fell upon a weakened Europe. The Black Death was a crisis of a different order. Not a slow grinding of starvation, but a swift, seemingly indiscriminate, and medically incomprehensible pestilence. It moved with terrifying speed, shattering communities, confounding beliefs, and ultimately acting as a brutal catalyst for social and economic revolution. The arrival of the Great Mortality, the pandemic, now known to be caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is believed to have originated in the arid grasslands of Central Asia. Climate changes in the region may have driven infected rodents and their fleas from their natural habitats into more populated areas, setting the stage for an epidemic. The plague was introduced to Europe in 1347 at the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, now Feudossia, in the Crimea. During a siege by the Golden Horde, the attacking army, ravaged by the disease, reportedly catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. A horrifying early instance of biological warfare. From Kaffa, Genoese merchant ships with plague-infected black rats and their fleas as stowaways carried the Great Mortality westward. It spread with breathtaking speed along the continent's maritime trade routes, reaching Constantinople, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula by the end of 1347, and from there, exploding across the rest of Europe. The disease manifested in 3 terrifying forms. The most common was the bubonic plague, transmitted by the bite of an infected flea. It was characterized by the agonizing swelling of lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck, which formed blackish pustules known as buboes. This form was fatal in approximately 60% of cases. far deadlier was the pneumonic plague, which occurred when the infection reached the lungs. It could then be transmitted directly from person to person through airborne droplets from coughing, spreading with the ease of a common cold, but with a mortality rate approaching 100%. The rapid inland spread of the plague, far faster than could be explained by rat migration alone, strongly suggests that this person-to-person transmission was a critical factor. The third form, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing overwhelming infection and death, often within hours, and was also nearly 100% fatal. The Black Death was one of the most lethal pandemics in human history. Between 1347 and 1351, it is estimated to have killed 30% to 60% of Europe's entire population, a staggering figure that may represent as many as 50 million people. Entire villages were wiped out. Flourishing cities saw their populations halved in a matter of months. The sheer speed and horror of the disease, with victims often dying in agony within 2 to 3 days of showing the first symptoms, induced a level of societal terror and psychological trauma that is difficult to comprehend. A world without cures. Faced with a disease of such virulence and mysterious origin, medieval society had no effective medical framework for understanding or combating it. In the absence of germ theory, explanations for the plague fell into 3 main categories: the supernatural, the environmental, and the conspiratorial. The most pervasive belief was that the Black Death was a manifestation of divine punishment, God's terrible wrath visited upon a sinful world. This interpretation led to widespread public acts of religious penance. Cities organized solemn processions and mass prayers in a desperate attempt to appease an angry deity. The most extreme manifestation of this was the flagellant movement. Groups of penitents traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with iron-spiked scourges until they bled, believing their self-inflicted suffering could atone for the sins of the world and end the plague. The dominant medical theory of the day was based on the classical idea of miasma, or corrupted air. Learned physicians, such as those at the medical faculty in Paris, proposed that a rare conjunction of planets had caused the release of poisonous vapors into the atmosphere, which then spread the pestilence. This led to public health measures aimed at purifying the air. Large bonfires were lit in town squares, and individuals were advised to burn aromatic woods like juniper and rosemary in their homes. People carried bouquets of flowers, posies, or scented sponges soaked in vinegar to hold to their noses when in public, a practice grimly memorialized in the nursery rhyme, "Ring Around the Rosie." In the climate of fear and helplessness, paranoia and suspicion flourished, leading to the scapegoating of marginalized groups. Across Europe, but particularly in the Rhineland and France, Jewish communities were falsely accused of causing the plague by deliberately poisoning wells. This baseless accusation unleashed horrific waves of anti-Semitic violence. Despite the pleas of Pope Clement VI, who pointed out that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, thousands were tortured into false confessions and then burned at the stake or massacred by terrified mobs. Individual treatments were a desperate and ineffective mix of academic medicine based on humoral theory, folk herbalism, and pure superstition. Physicians prescribed bloodletting and purging to rebalance the body's humors. Surgeons lanced the buboes to release the poison, a painful and dangerous procedure. A vast pharmacopoeia of remedies was tried, including pastes made of figs, cooked onions, and even human excrement applied to the sores. People consumed complex potions containing dozens of ingredients, from rare herbs to crushed emeralds and powdered unicorn horn. Amidst this chaos, however, a few rational and effective strategies did emerge, born not of theory, but of brutal observation. The wealthy who could afford to simply fled infected cities for isolated country estates. More significantly, civic authorities in forward-thinking Italian port cities like Venice and Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, noticed the disease seemed to arrive with ships. They instituted the first organized public health measures, ordering incoming ships and their crews to remain isolated offshore for a period of 30 and later 40 days. A quarantino, the origin of modern quarantine. Some cities, like Milan, took the brutal step of walling up the houses of the infected, sealing the sick and the healthy inside together to die. These measures, along with the later establishment of dedicated plague hospitals, known as lazarettos, were the first glimmers of a modern approach to contagious disease control. The Great Dying and the Peasant Experience. While the plague struck all classes, it did not do so equally. The peasantry and the urban poor suffered the highest mortality rates. Their living conditions were a perfect storm for the spread of the disease. Small, dark, and poorly ventilated cruck houses, where multiple family members lived in a single room, often alongside their livestock, were ideal breeding grounds for the black rats that carried the plague-infected fleas. Poor sanitation and hygiene in villages further facilitated its spread. Crucially, the Black Death did not strike a healthy and robust population. It arrived only a generation after the Great Famine had inflicted years of chronic malnutrition across Europe. The peasantry, having suffered most acutely during the famine, entered the plague years with likely compromised immune systems, creating a demographic vulnerability that the pestilence exploited with devastating efficiency. The famine acted as a grim prelude, a softening up phase that amplified the lethality of the plague when it finally arrived. The sheer terror and the speed with which the plague killed ripped apart the social bonds that held communities together. In normal times, the close-knit village was a source of strength and mutual support. During the plague, it became a death trap, a vector for rapid transmission. Contemporary chroniclers like the Italian Giovanni Boccaccio described a complete societal breakdown. Brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, sister by brother, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited. People became too afraid to help their sick neighbors or even their own family members. Traditional funeral rites, so central to medieval religious life, were abandoned. The dead accumulated too quickly to be given proper burials, and were instead collected by cart and dumped into vast, hastily dug plague pits. For the average peasant, who lacked the financial resources to flee, survival options were almost non-existent. They were trapped in their villages, forced to watch their families and neighbors die around them. Their primary recourse was to the same ineffective folk remedies, prayers, and religious processions that were failing everywhere. Isolation was the only truly effective strategy. But for a peasant living in a crowded hut and dependent on communal agriculture. It was an impossible one. They died, as Boccaccio wrote of the rural poor, not like men, but like animals, on the roads, in their fields, or in their houses at all hours, by day and night. Part 4. The World Remade, a New Dawn for the Survivor. The Black Death was an unparalleled human tragedy, a maelstrom of death and grief that left Europe scarred for generations. Yet, paradoxically, for the peasants who survived, the aftermath of the Great Mortality created a world of unprecedented opportunity. The demographic collapse shattered the foundations of the old feudal order, fundamentally altering the balance of power between labor and land. In the post-plague world, the peasantry, far from being a beaten-down remnant, emerged as empowered agents who would challenge the aristocracy and accelerate the end of the medieval world. The laborer is worthy of his hire. The death of as much as half the population in less than 5 years created an immediate and severe labor shortage on a scale never seen before. In the pre-plague world, a surplus of peasants had competed for limited land and resources, giving lords immense power. In the post-plague world, the situation was reversed. Land was now plentiful, with entire holdings and even villages abandoned, while labor was suddenly a scarce and precious commodity. This new economic reality gave the surviving peasants leverage they had never possessed. Lords, whose wealth was derived entirely from the working of their land, found themselves desperate for tenants to farm their fields and laborers to bring in their harvests. For the first time, peasants were in a position to negotiate. They demanded and received dramatically higher wages for their work. A chronicle from Rochester lamented that aristocrats were forced to pay triple the pre-plague wages to their workers. This newfound economic power fundamentally shattered the bonds of serfdom. A serf who was denied better terms by his lord could now simply walk away, confident that another lord, desperate for workers, would eagerly hire him. To prevent their entire workforce from abandoning them, lords were forced to make concessions. They began commuting the hated traditional labor services into fixed and often lower cash rents. The legal restrictions on movement became unenforceable. In effect, serfdom, the bedrock of the manorial system, collapsed in most of Western Europe within a generation of the plague's arrival. For the survivors, the standard of living improved dramatically. Not only did wages for laborers skyrocket, but the drastic reduction in population also meant there was an oversupply of goods, causing the prices of food and other necessities to fall. With higher incomes and lower costs, peasants could afford a more varied and nutritious diet, including more meat, dairy, and ale. They could afford better clothing, and many were able to rent or acquire larger plots of land, becoming prosperous, small farmers in their own right. The Black Death, in its cruel and indiscriminate reaping, had inadvertently created a golden age for the European laborer. The Empire Strikes Back, the Statute of Laborers, and peasant revolts. The ruling class watched this transformation with horror. In their worldview, which was based on a divinely ordained and static social hierarchy, the newfound prosperity and assertiveness of the peasantry was an unnatural and dangerous inversion of the proper order of things. They saw peasants dressing in finer clothes, demanding higher pay, and abandoning their traditional deference. Their response was swift and reactionary. to use the power of the state to turn back the economic clock. In England, this reaction took the form of the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Labourers in 1351. This landmark legislation made it a criminal offense for employers to offer or for workers to accept wages higher than those that had been standard before the plague. The laws also restricted the movement of laborers, making it illegal to leave one's parish in search of better pay, and compelling any able-bodied person to accept work from the first lord who demanded it. Though theoretically applicable to all, in practice, the laws were enforced almost exclusively against the workers, with fines, branding, and imprisonment used to punish those who dared to demand what the free market now offered them. These laws were fiercely resented and widely ignored, but they created a deep well of political anger among the peasantry that had just begun to taste economic freedom. This simmering discontent was brought to a boil by the fiscal demands of the state. The ongoing 100 Years' War with France required massive funding, which the English crown sought to raise through a series of new, highly unpopular taxes, culminating in the poll tax of 1380. This tax was levied on every adult, regardless of income, and was a heavy burden on poor peasant families. The combination of wage suppression and heavy taxation proved to be an explosive mixture. This context is crucial for understanding the great peasant uprisings of the late 14th century. These were not the desperate, chaotic riots of a starving populace, as might have occurred during the Great Famine. Instead, they were organized political movements born of empowerment. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, like the Jacquerie in France in 1358, occurred precisely because the economic position of the peasantry was stronger than ever before. The rebels were not fighting for a crust of bread. They were fighting to protect the economic and social gains they had made since the plague. They were fighting against an aristocracy that was trying to legislate them back into serfdom. Their demands were accordingly radical and political. An end to all serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax, the removal of corrupt royal officials, and a cap on land rents. The Black Death had not just altered the economy, it had transformed the peasant mindset. It had given them a sense of their own value and the confidence to demand a new, more just social contract. Though the great revolts were brutally suppressed, the tide of history could not be turned back. The old manorial order was dead. The resilient spirit, community, culture, and continuity. The survival of the medieval peasantry cannot be measured in economic or political terms alone. It was also rooted in deep wells of cultural and psychological resilience, centered on the enduring structures of the village community, religious faith, and oral tradition. Despite the horrors of famine and plague, the village remained the fundamental unit of peasant life. The bonds of kinship and neighborhood, forged over generations, provided a framework for mutual support. The very nature of medieval agriculture, particularly the open field system, necessitated cooperative labor. Tasks like plowing with a shared team of oxen, haymaking in the common meadows, and bringing in the harvest required the entire community to work in concert. This shared work and the shared experience of hardship fostered a powerful sense of solidarity that helped communities endure crises. The commons, the shared pastures, woods, and wastelands of the manor, acted as a crucial economic buffer, providing free access to firewood, grazing for livestock, and foraged foods, resources that were outside the direct control of the Lord and vital in times of scarcity. Religion was the all-encompassing framework of the medieval world, providing a shared language and worldview that helped people make sense of their precarious existence. The local church was the center of the village, its bells marking the hours of the day, and its calendar of feasts and fasts marking the rhythm of the year. While the church was often an oppressive institution, demanding tithes and free labor on its own lands, it also offered profound spiritual solace. It provided rituals to mark the great passages of life, baptism, marriage, death, and offered the promise of a better life after death as a reward for earthly suffering, a powerful coping mechanism in an age of high mortality. In a society where the vast majority were illiterate, oral tradition was the primary vehicle for culture, entertainment, and social commentary. In the dark evenings of winter, or during the brief rests from labor, storytelling was a vital communal activity. Folk tales, legends, fables, and songs, passed down through generations, served not only to entertain, but also to transmit values, history, and a shared sense of identity. Crucially, these stories provided a space for psychological resilience and a form of cultural resistance. Tales like those of Robin Hood, which became immensely popular in the later Middle Ages, articulated the deep-seated peasant grievances against a corrupt and unjust social order. In these ballads, the enemies were not distant kings, but the immediate and tangible figures of oppression: greedy abbots, abusive sheriffs, and unjust lords. Robin Hood did not seek to overthrow the kingdom, but to find justice for the common person within it, often by appealing directly to a good king who would right the wrongs of his corrupt local officials. These stories provided a powerful psychological outlet, reinforcing a communal sense of justice and imagining a world where the powerful were held accountable, even when reality offered little hope of it. Conclusion: the legacy on survival. The story of the medieval peasant is a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The centuries-long struggle against the systemic oppression of the manorial system, the catastrophic shock of the Great Famine, and the unparalleled horror of the Black Death forged a class of people defined by their resilience. This report has argued that the peasantry were not the passive, downtrodden victims of popular imagination, but were instead active and resourceful agents in their own survival, whose collective actions and reactions to crisis fundamentally reshaped the course of European history. Their survival was a dynamic process, an interplay of endurance, adaptation, and resistance. They endured the relentless extraction of their labor and wealth by lords and church through a deep-rooted knowledge of the land and the seasons. They adapted to crises by leveraging communal resources like the commons, by relying on the social cohesion of the village, and by drawing psychological strength from their faith and folklore. And they resisted, not only in the dramatic, fiery revolts that periodically shook the foundations of the feudal order, but also in the daily, subtle acts of non-compliance and the shrewd, legalistic maneuvering within the Lord's own courts. The great catastrophes of the 14th century, while inflicting unimaginable suffering, acted as powerful, if brutal, catalysts for change. The Great Famine exposed the fatal weaknesses of the manorial system, eroding its legitimacy long before the plague arrived. The Black Death then shattered the demographic and economic structures that had kept that system in place for centuries. It was the surviving peasants who, by seizing the opportunities created by the ensuing chaos, translated this demographic collapse into a social revolution. Their demands for fair wages, personal freedom, and justice were not the cries of a beaten people, but the confident assertions of a class that had survived the apocalypse and recognized its own indispensable value. Their struggle, in the fields, in the courts, and in the great uprisings, drove the final nails into the coffin of serfdom in Western Europe, irrevocably altering the balance of power between labor and land. In surviving, they did more than simply live to see another day. They laid the groundwork for the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the modern one, proving that the unbroken spine of the common person could, in the end, bear the weight of the world and remake it.